Nearly 53 years ago, on August 28, 1963, more than 200,000 citizens descended on the nation's capital. People from all walks of life and races arrived to make the case for more jobs, freedom, and an end to racial discrimination. African Americans of all ages demanded the right to vote, integration into schools, hotels, restaurants, and the most basic of tenets, to be treated with dignity. 2 months prior to the march, President Kennedy had proposed a civil rights bill that required African Americans to have equal access to public accommodations and the right to vote. In the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, activists stood together in an act of solidarity to create lasting social change. For many, this was the pinnacle march of racial divide in America and was a testament that so many people from differing backgrounds could stand side by side, fighting together for such a humane cause. America was at a crossroads early in the 1960s, and many were looking to move on from the divisive Jim Crow laws imposed in the South. These laws mandated segregation of public schools, transportation, restrooms, and even water fountains. Like a freight train that could not be stopped, the time had come for African Americans to stand up for equality and exclaim to the world that the United States was ready for a new era, an era devoid of systematic racism and segregation. Leading up to the march in 1963, African Americans in the United States and primarily in the South lived in a society that did not view them as equals. Even though President Lincoln had instituted the Emancipation Proclamation 100 years before, segregation was still being instituted in the United States Army, public schools, and public buildings. Throughout many neighborhoods across the country, the restriction to sell homes to African Americans was considered a normal practice. On December 1st, 1955, an African American seamstress named Rosa Parks, who was returning from her place of employment, was told to vacate her seat to a white passenger on a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Parks refused to give up her seat and was arrested and fined for her actions. Led by a young pastor named Martin Luther King Jr., people joined together to boycott the Montgomery public bus system. Many look to this incident as the beginning of the civil rights movement in America. In December 1962, civil rights activist A. Philip Randolph and his assistant Bayard Rustin envisioned a march that would attract people to the nation's capital from every corner of America. A march that focused on civil rights and economic inequality, they hoped to attract more than 100,000 citizens to the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The march would feature speeches from several prominent activists and religious leaders. More than 20 years prior, Randolph had led the March on Washington movement, which had been a driving force in the issuance of Executive Order 8802. This executive order banned discrimination in the defense industries during World War II. Randolph had always believed that economic injustices were the major reason that millions of Americans were struggling in poverty. Also, he was convinced that economic equality for minorities could come only through a fair distribution of wealth and power and a vast expansion in the horizons of opportunity. On that historic summer day in August 1963, A. Philip Randolph delivered the opening speech, and the March on Washington had officially begun. Standing in front of more than double the amount of people he had estimated would show up for the event, he spoke about the plight of African Americans, civil rights, economic equality, and insisted that making available good-paying jobs to all Americans would be the true key to freedom. In addition to Randolph, several well-known civil rights activists, including Roy Wilkins, James Farmer, John Lewis, Whitney Young Jr., and the only female to make a speech, Josephine Baker, addressed the enormous crowds. In the finale, Martin Luther King Jr. presented the I Have a Dream speech, which inspired a generation. From all parts of the United States, participants came in buses, trains, cars, and airplanes to listen to the speeches, listen to the music, and directly influence those in power, most of whom did not know at the time that they would be part of such a historic event that would be remembered forever, the 1963 March on Washington.